Okay, so welcome back to the Ask the R podcast. Joining me today is Ian Gracie. Now, Ian, just for the uninitiated, first off, can you tell us who you are and what it is that you do?
Hi, yeah, so I'm I suppose one of the rare people that speak online about planning. It's not really a sexy topic, but yeah, I've been a planner for about 12 years. I was a planning consultant for a while, and then I've spent most of my time inside a local authority, inside a council. So I was the one assessing planning applications. And the reason I went to a local authority was genuinely to understand what good development was, because it was a weird thing when I was a consultant where I didn't. Well, I was very junior, but it was really hard to understand what good development was because you're always setting yourself up for refusal and charging all these fees and doing all this research. And then I actually found out finally what it was like inside a council. And then I found, as I'm sure you do in your line of work, is that it's like there's these unnecessary secrets being held. Like, there's no, it's very us against them. So in both instances, and there's kind of this adversarial approach to planning, and they're always trying to get one over on the other. So basically, my whole mantra is to basically just basically shed the light bit on planning, and it's nowhere near as complex as it's made out to be. And really, my kind of idea is to just kind of shed light as to what it's like inside an authority, because I see so many people lose untold amounts of money and spend crazy amounts of money on consultants when they needn't have it done. So yeah, generally that's what I'm about at the moment.
I think sometimes I'll come back to that in a minute, but I think sometimes what our customers find is they lack the sort of confidence. I think they lack the confidence to push back. They almost feel like they're dealing with the police in a strange way, and that if they push back on any points, you know there's going to be a big red X behind closed doors put on their application, and they're going to have a negative experience moving forwards. And we deal with a very wide spread of planning applications, from very, very small householder applications right through to multi-unit developments, and so inconsistent right the way across the country. And this is why I thought it'd be interesting to get you on, because a lot of our listeners, they are gonna view you as the enemy, and
Yeah.
that must make you feel absolutely horrendous.
Well, I felt like the enemy, yeah, when I was an officer. I've always felt like the enemy. So it's a funny thing. Basically, if you choose planning as a career, you are the enemy no matter what side you're on. Because when you're a private consultant, obviously you have your clients. But I remember once telling someone that I was in planning, and they immediately asked me if I was on the public sector or the private side, and I said private side. She immediately hated me. And then when I moved to the public side, everyone, because of this smoke screen between the authority, everyone assumes relationships are going on between you and the applicant, or you and the developer, or you and residents that just aren't true. So everyone thinks stuff's going on that isn't, and they just see you as. And unfortunately, for a planning officer, like putting it like as a planning officer, this is kind of why I did it, because I was quite passionate about it. Your name is the one on the application. You're the focus of all the attention, not XYZ authority, although generally speaking, you are. But you're the focus of the attention for everything, and that's the applicant who wants to see their application done on time. It's the resident that wants to make sure that their comments are listened to, and also people don't quite appreciate the stress officers are on. So your manager is that application is there. There's a in the background. There's all these stats going on that the public don't see about how long that application is taking, because if a and the government is getting stronger and stronger on this. If your application is taking too long, then you go over time, and when you go over time, that goes down as like a stat on you personally as being slow, but also on the council, and that means now the government are threatening stepping in if the council's taking too long. So it's a really, really hard place to be for a planning officer. It's a lot. It's a lot to juggle. So yeah, in short, everyone does hate you.
It's it, it, it's a tough place to be, and I have a lot of sympathy. We've got a lot of good relations with not only planning officers but also consultees within the local authorities as well. So ecologists, arboricultural consultants, roads, heritage, all that kind of good stuff. And I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm whiter than white, because we have played the they're evil, they're playing games cards on numerous occasions, and in fact we have to in some of our marketing.
Which they do sometimes, by the way.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
not immune from it. I'm not
yeah.
saying they're like these
No,
saints.
no, but it quite often, we know that we can help people, so we have to use language and terminology that will get them to take action. I do a weekly email newsletter out to our various different lists, and we've got one going out this week because we're coming up to Christmas. We've got these kind of manufactured deadlines going on at the moment, so we're getting customers coming back to us who we're quoting, and they're saying things like, we've got a deadline of the 23rd of December. We absolutely must have your bat report or your tree report by the 23rd of December. And you sort of say to them, okay, but do you honestly think that anybody is going to do anything with that between the 23rd of December and the 3rd of January? And I don't know
Well,
what your view on that is, but
I know exactly why they're doing that. And so the life as a planning consultant in terms of when your work, so when you're an officer, your workload is just constant. It's just never ending, right? But for a planning consultancy, your clients obviously have various reasons as to they've got financial reasons or whatever. When you submit your planning application, provided everything is right, and I know you know everything about making sure your reports are accurate and your drawings are correct and all that, if you submit something on the 23rd of December, even if the whole planning authority goes on holiday, which they won't, but even if they do, if your application is correct on the 23rd, that means that even if they validate it in January 15th, the clock still starts on the 23rd of December.
okay.
That means that whole 8 week thing, or 13 weeks if you're doing majors, starts then. But if you if you do that, and this is where planning consultants come involved, if you do that, you really have to make sure you're correct, because if you're not, and this is why clients get so hot on it, is because if it's wrong and they do then go and validate it, well, go to validate it on the 15th, if something's wrong, the clock does not start on the 23rd. It starts whenever the authority choose to start it. So if they go January 15th, or we're missing a tree report, you go to it yourselves, go and do the tree report. It's probably going to take you 10 days, 2 weeks, I don't know. Then it's got to get submitted. You're talking at the end of January before then, you've a delay in a month. So that's why, like Fridays are a very busy time for planning consultants, because they want to get those 2 days before the weekend like tacked into the
You just
timeline.
wonder, don't you, in the overall scheme of things? And I mean, majors, it could be different because there's all sorts of commercial pressures going on there. But you do wonder, in the grand scheme of things, with a lot of the smaller schemes that we deal with, does it really make much of a difference in the grand scheme of things? A few weeks here and there, it just seems like one of those things that's sort of ingrained rather than is an actual useful way to act.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, you don't know what each person's going through, but yeah, that is true. And it was always a frustration. It was funny seeing it from the other side when I was an officer, because uh, everyone just gets really het up. Like they're contacting you constantly. Is this valid? Is it? And they're going to check this. They're really on you to make sure that. So yeah, it's an interesting seeing it from both sides.
From a planning officer's perspective, have you seen the scope and breadth of individuals coming into that space? Are they getting younger? Are they getting older? Are they lasting a couple of years and then going, bugger this, we're off to the private sector? Because I'm obviously, our head office is up in the Scottish Highlands, which is where I am at the moment. I have a little bit of insight into our local authority because I live next door to somebody fairly senior in the planning department,
Okay.
which is always interesting. However, we're constantly stumbling across a lot of graduates who are very much crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's because they're fearful of making any sort of pragmatic decisions. Is that something that you would sort of agree with, or?
So the topic of planning is fascinating to learn, to study. So when you're studying it, it's absolutely fascinating, and the topic gets a lot of interest, just like in terms of development. Unfortunately, the public sector is absolutely on its knees, and that's like, people complain about, me as an officer and the authority in terms of performance, but it is a horrible place to work for a graduate or someone coming into it. So basically, being blunt is that you go to an authority, and yes, you do have graduates. They're super keen, and they're the ones that you find um, are really responsive early on because they've, being honest, they haven't been weathered by the planning system yet. So yeah, so you do get a lot of churn. You do. They quite honestly, people you can be working at authority a long time, get super, super experienced, and way more experienced than you would ever get as a planning consultant. The experience I got in however many years I was an officer compared to the little time relatively that I was a planning consultant is just night and day. The experience you get is insane, but there is no denying the fact that it's a thankless job and you don't get paid very much. And that is the truth of it. Life costs a lot, and being a planning officer in the public sector is not well paid. So there is a lot of churn, yeah. And also, there's depending on the authority, I think it's very rife in London, in particular, is that you do get a lot of contractors jumping around different authorities. So that's why there's this kind of age-old complaint that, oh, my planning officer's changing. That's because planning authorities have their staff, their kind of core staff. But when things get really bad, they find this kind of budget to pay for contractors. And each authority is basically jumping out, oh, there's demand over here, there's demand over there. And then so they're always jumping around. So that's why you kind of get that officer changing. But it's like I say, it's a fascinating topic, but the realities of it, I think, people burn people out, and that's why you tend to find people move on.
We're seeing exactly the same at the moment side of things. So we've got graduate ecologists coming into the sector who, and I'm going to use crude language because I am just a crude tree surgeon by trade. They do want to save the world, however, the vast majority of what happens in an ecological consultancy that does a lot of planning work is that you're fighting all the time to save very small areas of habitat and try and do the best you can for protected species. And the churn for graduate ecologists, they're getting ground into the ground at the moment. There's a lot of really good people went to work on HS2 because they were throwing money left, right, and centre.
Mm.
And that's meant that most ecological consultancies in the UK at the moment are employing graduates and people with fairly limited experience and pushing them into extremely complicated situations and scenarios.
Right.
And it's a real struggle at the moment. And BNG, which we'll come on to later, has just made that worse. Really,
That's interesting.
it's really ramped up the pressure. But before I go down that particular rabbit hole, I guess there's going to be people listening to this who have a rough idea of what a planning officer is, but perhaps you could just give us a high level sort of overview of what that role actually entails. I understand it, but I'm sure there's going to be listeners that they see planning officer at the bottom of an email and they think, well, surely this, because what we hear, to give it some context, what we get is the planning officers told me I don't need a bat survey. And I say to them, well, I'm telling you, you do. The planning officer isn't the consultee. The ecologist hasn't looked at the planning application yet. And I can tell, looking at what you're proposing to do, you are definitely going to need a bat survey or you're definitely going to need a tree survey. And we get huge pushback against that. And quite often we'll then see that person come back maybe 3 or 4 weeks later when the consultee has looked at it and gone, no, you need this, this, and this.
The
So maybe just a
tail
high
between the
level
legs.
overview of the planning officer's role would possibly be useful.
Yeah, touching on that specific example. So basically, there are checks and balances, and so when you have a planning application, depending on what it is, whether it's a rear extension, 5 houses, 1,000 homes, whatever, there's what's called a validation checklist. So every authority has this published document that shows what documents and what reports you need, depending on the application or depending on what constraints you have. However, that is not an automated process. So it means that if you're, for instance, a graduate, doesn't really know what they're doing and they haven't, and because the department is so busy, they maybe haven't had the right onboarding that they should have had, whatever, right? That means that mistakes are rife. So, and hands up, I used to do them all the time because there isn't an automated process. We can talk about how the government's going to try and change that, but it means that on the individual basis, they're looking, or do I need this? Do I know? And it's very common that they just miss something. So in that situation, yes, that is very, very common. And I've heard you say on podcasts before, like it comes back to bite you in the end. Whether you get through the planning process now, it's great, or you've got planning permission, whatever. But guarantee you that when they go through, when the officer goes to, so they write their reports and they send it off to their manager and they check it. The manager will say like, all right, where's the tree report? Where's that? And it may be, I'm not saying it, they may come back and say, I need a tree report right at the end of the process, which will be a nightmare, or they'll whack it on as a condition, which means that you basically need to go through the whole planning process again to get that condition discharged. So exactly right what you're saying. Basically, and this is what I talk about, there's so much stuff you can check yourself, you don't need a consultant for, that you can find all that stuff out. Anyway, back to your original question. A planning officer is the person who assesses any application to the authority with regards to planning, and that could be a certificate, so that can be PD for rear extension if you want to do 3 meters, even small things like that. You submit like what's called I don't want to get too technical, but a proposed certificate, and then they issue the certificate. And then there's also the prior approval process, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, which is things like commercial to resi, really big rear extensions, or Part 20, which is extensions on blocks of flats or various buildings for new flats. There's a prior approval process. They assess those, and they also assess full planning applications, which is basically everything else. So they are making a decision, they're assessing and making a decision on your application, which is just in a very short sentence what they do. But there is so much more to what they actually do. They are, like I said, they are the focal point of that planning application for the applicant, for the manager, but also they're responsible for making sure relevant people like trees are consulted on during the application. So what happens is, let's say that you've got you want to build 2 houses on this gap site and it's got loads of trees on it. There's issues with that. One is the trees, and the other one is probably things like transport, where you need to make sure the parking is in place or the visibility displays are correct or whatever. And maybe you're in a conservation area too. So those are 3 major, and sustainability is always one now. But those are 3 major areas. That means that officer needs to consult with those 3 major consultees. So they'll get their application. And this is why it's so important to get your reports right, because it's not the officer checking everything. It's the relevant consultee. So your application needs to be correct all the way through. So your transport officer, your conservation officer, your trees officer, and then also your sustainability officer, which is almost central to every application now. So they have to manage every one of those consultees to make sure that they get their comments back on time so that you can make your decision on time. But each one of those consultees is also being consulted on every other application that's going on in the council. So the time management thing of that is absolutely insane and is impossible to manage, to the point where, like, everyone's like, this is too busy, I just can't keep up with this. As much as an officer is immune to, for instance, like an applicant chasing them, where's my decision, so is that transport officer and conservation officer, where the officer, even though you might not know it, they are chasing like mad to, and I used to do this all the time. Can I please have your thoughts on this application? Please, please, please. I'm on my 8 weeks now. I need to make a decision, whatever. And I have had situations where, like, you get your response on whatever day 55 or whatever it is, and they object, and there's a huge issue. So the planning officer isn't just the one doing all the work. They have to go to other people within the council. And don't forget as well, if it's a tricky case, particularly junior officers, they'll have mentors within the department who will guide them throughout the application. So, there's meetings going on all the time that you don't know about. So yeah, they manage that whole process. They then also make the decision, and then they attach all the conditions. And then when you discharge those conditions, it's more often than not that they're the ones deciding those conditions as well. Yeah, and they have to manage all the neighbour consultees as well.
Would that be? I mean, I know your experience is particularly in a certain London borough, but I mean, how is that managed? Is that simply in and out of your email inbox all the time, or do local authorities generally have a system for? I saw the smile there.
Yeah, so there is so each council has, most councils use one particular system, but every other council has effectively their own internal software, which is a nightmare we don't have to get into. But when the application comes in and the officer validates it, there's an automation process where that software spits out something to that relevant consultee, like their general inbox, which will be application submitted for XYZ on this date. We need your comments. So they'll put it onto their list. And I think everyone has their own like Excel spreadsheet, literally, where they're just like going through one by one. And also don't forget as well, for people that haven't been through this process yet, is that even though you may get comments, there may be comments that are problematic, which you need to address. So even though like you might get your comments in time from the officer, if there's something wrong, that's going to add a bunch of time on as well. But yeah, in essence, there's an automated step at the beginning, but then after that, it's all email. You find out who that officer is, it's like your internal officer, and you're just chasing them constantly.
It sounds like hell. It sounds like hell on earth. I mean, I guess obviously in the private sector, we've got the advantage of a lot of different software tools that we can use. Commercial sensitivities around how we do it, but yeah, we've built our own platform for managing our work, and it's like a sausage factory. And luckily we've managed to integrate AI into the business as well. So as the process goes along, a lot of people are using AI as tools, but we're using it as an engine. So a report will get to a certain point in the kind of sausage factory, and it will dive in and out and do all that in a nice linear way, which I guess probably brings me quite nicely onto, obviously I've been stalking you on LinkedIn, and I can see that you're involved quite heavily in digital planning and the sort of direction that's going in. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, because you sort of touched on it a couple of minutes ago there.
Yeah, this is basically an issue that's rife within planning. So if, for instance, you are employed to go and work for someone, and you need to do an assessment of, find out what the constraints are or what the issues are with that particular authority. Right now, more often in most councils, you need to, bury yourself into their website, find the right maps, find the PDFs, and then find your location on that map, which sometimes is really grainy and impossible to do, and it's really hard to find. Basically, what's going on now is that the government is realizing that that is a huge issue, because it's just the amount of time it wastes is absolutely insane. And also, as I touched on earlier, there's these software issues where certain companies have councils over a barrel in terms of the software they provide them, because they do so many things and they're all unique to each council, which means that if they want, and it's not fit for purpose anymore. So if they ever want to change their software, it's a huge issue, because it's involved planning, licensing, trees, building control, all of these things. So the idea is that planning now, the goal is to have it all based on open data, so that anyone can interrogate data and understand the likelihood of their getting permission before they apply, which in essence is what everyone wants. And that makes a planning officer's life so much easier. So if you're on number 1 Windsor Road, you immediately know what all the constraints are on that site. You know exactly what policies are relevant. You know exactly what you need to submit based on what application. You can then submit it. That information is already with the officer, because what people don't know is that right now, when you submit an application, an officer has to check all the constraints, which is crazy. And then basically it's automating the process, making it incredibly easy, and it's also designed by officers. So that's the key thing, by planning officers rather than software providers. So if it works out, it's going to be a really massive shift in planning in this country. And I think the government are following through with it, but it's going to take a while because of those issues, like I said, with every authority being stuck on certain contracts and each council doing their own thing. So yeah, if it works out, it's going to be amazing. But it's
so immensely frustrating, some of the, and you can understand how local authorities have got themselves in the position where they're sort of tied to a particular piece of software, a particular provider, because local authority procurement is just a nightmare. But I said I was pulling my hair out, because obviously as an entrepreneur and business owner, if I see something shiny that I think is going to work in the business, I can implement it within 20 minutes. Recently I've got a newborn daughter, it's just gone a month old, and I had to,
congratulations.
thank you very much, and I had to register the birth. So I thought that'll be easy. And since COVID, the Highland Council up here, everything has gone online. So I thought even better, that'll be straightforward. So you go on the website, and you basically have to manually then email them to tell them I have a small human that needs to be registered. And then they phone you repeatedly from an unlisted number over a period of about a week, because you've got a newborn baby, so you're busy, so you keep missing the calls. So backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. And eventually you get to the right person, and you go through the process online. And you just think, my goodness, that could just all be fixed with, Calendly. They just put their details in, and bang, there you go. You can choose your appointment, speak to the person over the phone, and jobs are good. And yeah, you can see how members of the public find the planning system so desperately frustrating.
Yeah, but I mean, at its heart, it's because councils are being basically charged with finding cost savings themselves and raising income themselves. So they are on there basically having to make decisions for themselves about where to go. And it's once you make a decision, it's very hard to unpick. So it's like giving autonomy to an authority sounds great in practice, but when it comes to things like what you just laid out, it creates such an inconsistent experience for people across the country. And as you've identified, it's not planning on its own; it's also birth registration and things like that.
I think most people don't understand also what a massive revenue generator the planning department is in most local authorities, and that none of that, in my experience, very little, if any, of that money gets kept within the planning department to improve the system. So
Honestly, this
I can't talk about my over the hedge conversations because, excuse me, I'll get shot. Yeah, I just can't talk about it, but you know where I'm going with this, and how box loads of applications and millions of pounds worth of fees sitting around that are waiting to be determined, and yeah, it's crazy.
this is like a real bugbear of mine. You're absolutely right. Planning departments are the highest generating service of any authority, like statutory service as well. So if you think planning application fees alone, that's well, let's get down to the numbers. So basically, most councils have somewhere in the four figures of planning applications every year, ranging from a really small council that may have as little as 1,000 a year to others that are as high as 13,000. Each one of those comes with its own application fee. So if you know how much you have to spend for an application fee, you can do quick math to find out what that is. But that is just a fraction of what a planning authority can generate. There's also pre-app fees, which everyone has issues about, but there are pre-app fees. But then there's also the stuff that gets generated as a result of the planning application. So that can be contributions to transport, so Section 106 contributions. So that could be money for transport, it can be placements for young kids starting out in work, it can be community infrastructure levy, which is like or locally or nationally significant infrastructure projects. And we're talking millions and millions here for, particularly in inner London. And there's also things called PPAs, which is planning performance agreements, which is really only reserved for really major applications. And effectively, someone is paying for an officer to guarantee that they pick up the phone and they decide the application in the right time frame, in essence. But all of those things that I've said are honestly so much money, but the head of the service doesn't get to decide how that money is spent. So that planning department, you might think, oh, they're on the knees or whatever. They are on the knees, but that's because of a council decision to say that we're only going to give you enough so that you can basically just tread water, when in fact they create so much money where they could, in most cases, that they could really resource a planning department, but it doesn't happen. In honesty, it goes into the bigger pot because planning department also has to support things like planning policy or enforcement, or most like building control tends to fall under planning in a lot of places as well. So they are responsible for propping the council up. But you'd think if they made all that money and if you had a properly resourced planning department, they'd probably generate more money because people would invest in that authority because they know that they're going to get a good service. But it doesn't always work like that, or it doesn't work like that at all.
And when it comes to planning, two-pronged question. What do you see as the biggest opportunities coming on the horizon? I think we've possibly already covered that. What do you see as the biggest constraints coming?
Well, the biggest opportunity coming, I mean, there's only really one thing that's really changing right now, and that's the fact that the government are desperate for 1.5 million homes in 5 years. And they've already recognised that that figure is going to be a challenge, and they've been in less than 6 months, and they've already realised that that's going to be a challenge. So, I mean, if they ever unpick this idea, so they're making changes to the MPPF with this idea of brownfield passports and grey belt land, and only releasing proper nice green belt land in very, very special circumstances. And there's a basically concerted effort to deliver more housing. So there's an opportunity in housing, but that's only really once this whole idea has really been unpicked. Unfortunately, when new ideas come to play, they sound great and they're attention grabbing, but the actual detail on the ground for a planning officer to deal with is next to nothing. So I mean, it sounds like an opportunity, but right now it's only an opportunity until it gets figured out, and it hasn't been yet. The biggest constraint is just the biggest constraint is just carrying on as it is. I mean, the planning like the planning system is just a representation in my mind of like how the country is performing, and
Said right with you there.
it's absolutely on its knees. And if it carries on as it is, it's I've studied international planning, so I've always had an idea of what's going on internationally. And you just have to look in other countries to see how far behind we are. It's absolutely insane. The thing is, we touch on ideas that might solve the problem. And one thing that I think is definitely a good idea that's being looked at is the idea of effectively spatially planning the country, where there's like a nationally set idea of where development should go, this and that, rather than it being carved up into 330 different authorities or something, which is what we have. And if you're neighbouring one another like that, there's the difference in how you succeed in planning here as opposed to there is ridiculous. You could get success here and not there for the same thing. But setting it nationally is the way forward because, like I say, at the basic levels of planning officer, no planning officer studied what they. A planning officer studied really nice like systems around the world, or they studied how great things like Milton Keynes and garden cities can be created. But when they get into the planning system and they're suddenly dealt with this planning applications and certificates, it's not what they learn, and it's foreign. So a planning officer would love things to be easy. They want to do stuff like planning. They don't want to, uh, be dealing with bad software or constantly in negotiations with or fighting residents or being chased for making sure your decision is legally on time and all these things. They actually want to do planning. Then as hard as it is to appreciate, planning officers don't want to do the amount of work they have to do. Like, you might think they do, but they don't at the personal level. We're talking about right at the personal level now. They want things to be easier and they want cool things to be delivered, but the way the system is set up right now is just not possible. So I've kind of went off on one there, but
Yeah, it's great.
yeah. But yeah, if you can spatially plan the country, I think it's the way forward. And then there's only one place in the country really where there's regional planning. That's London. They're thinking about it with Birmingham and Manchester as well. But that is personally, I think, got to be the way forward.
I think it's great, and thanks for your insights because it humanises something that I think people do feel very strongly about. And we see there's two extremes. There is a generation that we deal with, probably I'm going to say in 60 to 70s, who think that, oh, there's a bit of land, I can buy that and do whatever I want with it. Just absolutely, totally, and utterly blown out of the water and dismayed when they realise the constraints on that. And our whole messaging is sort of trees first, not last. It's like, just speak to us. We'll give you free advice. Please don't go and spend 20 grand on that
Mm.
acre of land in the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead that you think you can build a house on. There's a reason why it's 20 grand and not 1,000, 300,000, 400,000 pounds. Speak to us, little tiny bits of land that are divided up and sold on Rightmove with red lines on it. And you look at it and you just think, how's the person at the end ever going to develop that plot? They've got to go through everybody else's services, blah, 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 blah. Just speak to us. So you've got that extreme, and then you've got the younger people who are they want to push forwards, but they're so just totally and utterly overwhelmed and dismayed at the whole thing. And I think there is this whole them and us thing, which I'm hoping this podcast will go some way towards disbanding that a little bit, certainly for our customers and listeners anyway,
Yeah,
because we're all in the same boat. We're all trying to achieve something, and we're trying to achieve it in the best way we possibly can do. Yeah, I get CC'd into some emails, and sometimes this is all my consultants have their photo on their email, and there's a reason for that. Is because it humanises the interaction. When we deliver reports, we deliver it with a video walkthrough to humanise quite often the bad news. And
yeah,
I see some of the emails flying back to planning consultants, and you think you wouldn't speak to them if they were stood in front of you like that. They're just trying to do their job. And I know there's exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, I like to think that everybody's a good human being and we're all trying to just do our job at the end of the day. So, yeah.
yeah. I've reminded me of a point. It's like one of the reasons why planning officers can be so cold is just basically based because of everything we've touched on. Like the human element is almost taken out of them because everything they say, and that speaks to the whole us versus them thing. Like anything they say in a meeting, or particularly say in an email, gets really held against them. So they're very but particularly like very savvy planning consultants that know what they're doing, that kind of nimbly work through the system. They know that they can jump on things that are said. So that's why, from a planning officer's point of view, and I hated it at the beginning, but over time you become that because you just have to. You have to watch your back because they're after you. Quite honestly, whether it's an applicant or like residents as well. Residents jump on something you say, but you said this. So how is that possible? And similarly, like you said at the beginning with the pre-app, oh, I don't need a tree report because the officer said this. Yeah, it's a rock and a hard place for an officer.
Certainly, there's something that we remind our customers of on a sort of a daily basis because quite often they'll have a conversation with an officer on site and then the email is very different. And you just say to them, look, whatever they write, whatever they write is going to be in the public domain and they can be held accountable to it. So you've just got to play the game. You've got to play
Yeah,
the
and
game.
also the same with like pre-apps though. Pre-apps I think are technically publicly available if you ask for them for freedom of information requests, but generally speaking they're kept private. And there's always this catch-all line at the end of pre-application advice which says this is not legally binding on this is not a view of the council on this application. It's just a catch-all to say if we've made a mistake, we can get out of it. Being blunt, I've had cases where like an officer did a pre-app, they left, and I took it over, and it was so wrong. I'm not saying I was perfect by any stretch. I made mistakes all the time, but it was so wrong that we just had to go back on it. And it was a terrible thing. It's a big development, a lot of money involved, and they got really this kind of green light, and they should have known really, but they got this green light from a really bad bit of advice, and I had to kind of claw it back, and it's a really, really bad experience for the applicant. But speaking to what you said earlier about the older generation buying land and thinking know what they can do with it, and the younger generation not knowing what to do, that's effectively those exact people that I'm trying to target. It's the people that don't know how to approach the planning system and are just lost in this maze of confusion. But also the people that have been through it have been burnt and want to know why. And that's effectively what I'm trying to do. When you get consultants on board, great. But to my mind, there's steps way before that. If you get a consultant or a tree officer, a tree consultant on board, that's too late. You don't buy land. You don't buy land without doing basically the stuff that I preach, because you can very easily identify, do I need a tree consultant? Or even if I do, does it stack up at the end game? Like, well, I can do this research, say I've got this bit of land, you do this bit of research that I talk about, and then you basically quickly find out what the issues are, and then you have a running cost in your mind and time delays and all this kind of stuff, reports that I'll need, and are those issues through the planning application process? It can all be figured out. It sounds complex now, but it's really not. So that's why you get you get emails on board. You get emails during the application process, but that's too late. Way, way, way too late.
I mean, we've had quite recently. BNG is a big one for us at the moment, which probably we won't dip our toe into in this because we'll be here forever. A big one for us at the moment, and we're seeing quite a lot of it is developers who have small scale developers who maybe they dabbled in planning, maybe they worked in planning, maybe they work within building company, maybe they were an architect and they've decided to get into property development and they've bought a site and that site may have had planning and consent and it's lapsed. Might have only lapsed by 6 months, but they've got to go back through the system. And now there's a whole swathe of things, and they've got options on that land. There's cash tied up. There's all sorts of things. I had a guy pretty much in tears on the phone the other day because although there was historic consent on this site, it had lapsed. I think it lapsed about 18 months ago. So he's going back through. He thought it was a tick box exercise. It was going to be easy peasy, and of course now he's got caught up with biodiversity net gain, and he had to have hundreds of thousands of pounds of off-site credit or lose some of the units on site because it just wasn't developable.
Yeah, I
People
find
need to get the right advice early on to
yeah,
make the correct
it's
decisions.
interesting because I find it amazing how long knowledge takes to spread to the general public. Because I think a lot of people still think that you can just renew permissions. I think that used to be a thing. Even I think it's even before my time, when I've been in the game like 12 years, people still think you can like renew it, but that's not the case. So just to be clear, anyone listening, if your permission lapses, you do not just renew it. You have to go through the whole application process. If you're lucky, the exact policy climate is exactly the same as when you originally applied. If it's not, which in the case Matt just outlined, you may still get planning permission, but there may be a hell of a lot more that you need to do, whether financially or through reports. I had a personal example where I actually decided the application perfectly on time. So this guy, they wanted 2 houses, got permission, really nice design, lovely. They sat on that. So what happens is when you grant permission subject to a Section 106, which means that the officer has granted it, but now legal teams need to go sign this Section 106 to mean that that permission actually exists. That's only in certain types of applications. But anyway, once that's signed, then that's legal. But they then sat on that draft permission for a long time. And because I was so busy, I didn't chase it. It was just sat there. I was just waiting for legal teams to sort it. And our policy had changed during that process. So they left it so long, this was actually happened during the application, they left it so long that their affordable housing contribution for the original application was something like £10,000 to £20,000, which is not to be sniffed at. But by the time that they came to actually get the permission in place, they then had to spend 350 grand on affordable housing payments, all because they just sat on it. And it's had a similar example recently where, and this is another point to check, if you're buying a site with planning permission and you think it's all legit, please do check it. It can be tricky to spot sometimes, but please do check to make sure that what you've actually got permission for is buildable and accurate. Because I had this site where this guy got permission on this gap site, got permission, great, and then sold the permission on to someone. They bought it, carried on building. But what they didn't realise is the drawings that that permission got, and this is a mistake on all parties, by the council and by the previous applicant. The drawings were wrong. They showed the site as perfectly rectangular, when in actual fact it was like that. So it meant that they couldn't build what they wanted to. So I had to go through this whole permission process again, and it was a nightmare. And B&G came up, so it was basically they just check, always check.
Just get good advice. Just speak to good people. There's plenty of free advice there, and I guess probably as we come towards the end of this and wrap this up, I would say, Ian, how should people get in contact with you if they want to throw something in your direction? Do you even want them to throw questions in your direction?
Yeah, no, they can. To be honest, I'm almost solely on YouTube. I haven't posted in a while, but all the link there still works. So on all my videos there's a link, and maybe there'll be a link on this, I don't know, but there's a link, and then you can learn more there. I'm very much about basically teaching people how to navigate this maze, to understand what it's like inside, so you can kind of potentially win instead of getting just spat out by the whole system. So yeah, I'm mainly on YouTube.
Well, thanks a lot for coming onto the podcast. Really, really appreciate you giving up your time. I'm certainly going to continue to follow what you do moving into the future, and we'll try and remain optimistic about the whole thing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much.